It looked like a short war on television, almost clean, almost effortless. Bombs falling with surgical precision, green night vision images, missiles turning corners in midair. But what really happened in the desert in 1991? Was this simply a powerful coalition crushing a weaker enemy? Or was something deeper taking place beneath the explosions? Did this war actually change how wars would be fought forever? And if technology made warfare more precise, did it also make it more dangerous in ways few understood at the time? In this video, I'm going to discuss all of this, how it began, what happened, and how it changed the world. So without any delay, let's start. The Gulf War did not begin in January 1991 when bombs started falling on Baghdad. Its roots stretched back through decades of instability, ambition, and unresolved power struggles in the Middle East. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, emerged from the long and devastating Iran-Iraq War in the late 1980s, exhausted but heavily armed. The conflict had drained Iraq's economy, killed hundreds of thousands, and left the country buried in debt, particularly to its wealthy Gulf neighbors. Saddam believed Iraq had fought not just for itself, but on behalf of the Arab world, containing revolutionary Iran. What he expected in return was debt forgiveness and regional recognition. What he received instead was financial pressure and diplomatic isolation. Kuwait became the focal point of Saddam's frustration. Iraq accused Kuwait of exceeding oil production quotas, driving down prices and damaging Iraq's fragile economy. Baghdad also revived old territorial claims, arguing that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq, unjustly separated during the colonial era. These arguments were not new, but the post-Cold War environment gave Saddam the impression that global power dynamics were shifting. The Soviet Union, Iraq's longtime patron, was weakening. The United States appeared hesitant, adjusting to a world no longer defined by superpower standoff. In this uncertainty, Saddam miscalculated. When Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait in August 1990, the move shocked the world not because wars of aggression were unheard of, but because of its scale and boldness. Within hours, Iraqi tanks rolled across the border. Kuwait's defenses collapsed almost instantly. The country was occupied, its government fled, and Saddam declared Kuwait Iraq's 19th province. He seemed to believe the international response would be limited to condemnation and negotiation. Instead, the invasion triggered one of the largest military coalitions in modern history. The response was shaped by a moment of transition in global politics. The Cold War was ending, but its structures still existed. For the first time in decades, the United Nations Security Council functioned with real unity. The United States, no longer constrained by superpower rivalry, moved quickly to frame the invasion as a test of the post-Cold War order. If Iraq could absorb Kuwait by force, the message to the world would be clear. Borders meant little, and aggression paid. Operation Desert Shield began as a defensive mission. American and allied forces poured into Saudi Arabia, not to attack Iraq immediately, but to prevent further expansion. Saddam had one of the largest armies in the world, battle-hardened and experienced. If Iraqi forces moved south, Saudi Arabia's oil fields would be vulnerable. The initial buildup was massive, unprecedented in speed and scale. Troops, tanks, aircraft, and supplies crossed oceans and deserts, assembling with logistical precision that itself hinted at a new era of warfare. But the true transformation was not visible on the ground yet. It was shaping in command centers, satellites, and computer systems. For decades, militaries had relied on technology, but the Gulf War marked the first time digital integration became central rather than supportive. Satellites provided near real-time intelligence. GPS, still relatively new, allowed forces to navigate featureless deserts with accuracy that would have been impossible only years earlier. Commanders could see the battlefield as a system, not just a map. Iraq, by contrast, was preparing for a very different kind of war. Saddam expected a ground-heavy conflict, possibly similar to the Iran-Iraq War, where massed troops, artillery, and attrition dominated. Iraqi forces dug trenches, laid minefields, and positioned armor along predictable avenues of advance. This defensive posture made sense within older doctrines. What Saddam failed to understand is that the coalition did not intend to fight the war Iraq was prepared for. The air campaign that began in January 1991 shattered traditional expectations. Instead of immediately engaging ground forces, the coalition launched a sustained, technology-driven assault designed to paralyze Iraq's ability to fight before major ground combat even began. Precision-guided munitions struck command centers, air defenses, power grids, and communication networks. Stealth aircraft penetrated heavily defended airspace, attacking targets once considered unreachable. Cruise missiles flew hundreds of kilometers, hitting strategic locations with startling accuracy. For the first time, the world watched a war unfold almost live. Television broadcasts showed bombs entering buildings, bridges collapsing in single strikes, and night skies glowing over Baghdad. The war appeared controlled, almost clinical. This presentation mattered. Public perception became part of the battlefield. The coalition emphasized precision and restraint, contrasting it with Iraq's earlier aggression. Technology did not just shape combat, it shaped narrative. On the Iraqi side, confusion spread rapidly. Communications broke down, orders failed to reach units, radar systems went dark. Air defenses, once thought formidable, were systematically dismantled. Iraqi pilots rarely engaged coalition aircraft, and when they did, they were outmatched by superior sensors, training, and coordination. Within days, coalition forces achieved air supremacy so complete that Iraqi movements became nearly impossible without being detected and attacked. Yet this technological dominance masked a deeper truth. Precision weapons, though revolutionary, still made up a relatively small percentage of total munitions used. Most bombs dropped were conventional. What made them more effective was not just guidance systems, but information. Knowing where to strike, when to strike, and how targets were connected turned destruction into strategy. War was becoming less about raw firepower and more about systems disruption. For soldiers on the ground, the experience was surreal. Coalition troops trained extensively, rehearsing scenarios informed by satellite imagery and computer simulations. Iraqi soldiers, many poorly supplied and demoralized, waited under constant bombardment, unsure when or where the ground assault would come. Psychological warfare amplified the imbalance. Leaflets, broadcasts, and demonstrations of overwhelming force eroded Iraqi morale long before coalition tanks moved forward. The ground war, when it finally began, lasted only 100 hours. Coalition forces executed a sweeping maneuver, bypassing strong points, cutting off retreat, and collapsing resistance with speed that stunned observers. Entire Iraqi units surrendered without fighting. The battlefield did not resemble earlier wars of mass casualties and prolonged engagements. It looked like something new, something asymmetrical in capability rather than numbers. But beneath the apparent efficiency lay complex consequences. The war demonstrated that technology could compress time, reduce uncertainty, and magnify power. It also revealed how quickly outdated doctrines became liabilities. Iraq had numbers, experience, and fortifications, yet none of it mattered against an opponent that could see deeper, move faster, and strike smarter. What emerged from the Gulf War was not just a defeated army, but a new model of warfare, one where information dominance mattered as much as physical control, one where air power, networks, and precision reshaped strategy itself, and one where the gap between technologically advanced militaries and the rest of the world widened dramatically. At the time, this transformation felt decisive and reassuring to those who possessed it. The war seemed to promise cleaner victories, shorter conflicts, and fewer losses. But as the dust settled over the desert, a more troubling question began to surface. If war could now be fought this way, who would try to copy it? Who would try to counter it? And what would happen when technology spread beyond the hands of a few powerful states? As the coalition celebrated the speed of its victory, the deeper implications of what had happened were still unfolding. The Gulf War was not simply a demonstration of superior firepower, it was a demonstration of a new way of thinking about war itself. Commanders no longer focused solely on destroying enemy forces in the field. Instead, they aimed to collapse the enemy's ability to function as an organized system. Iraq's army did not have to be annihilated to be defeated. It only had to be blinded, isolated, and rendered incapable of coordinated action. This approach rested on a concept that would soon become central to modern military doctrine: information dominance. Coalition forces knew where Iraqi units were positioned, how they were supplied, and how they communicated. Satellites tracked movement. Electronic warfare disrupted signals. Aircraft hunted radar emissions automatically. The battlefield was no longer something commanders guessed at through delayed reports. It was something they could observe, update, and shape in near real time. That shift alone marked a revolution. For Iraqi forces, the experience was disorienting and terrifying. Soldiers described hearing explosions without seeing attackers, losing contact with commanders, and receiving contradictory or outdated orders. Units that tried to maneuver were destroyed from the air before they could even engage. Defensive lines that looked formidable on maps dissolved under precision strikes that targeted weak points rather than massed formations. Their logic of preparation collapsed under a reality they had not trained for. Yet technology alone did not win the war. It amplified advantages that already existed. Coalition pilots were extensively trained, commanders rehearsed complex maneuvers repeatedly, logistics chains functioned with extraordinary efficiency. Technology allowed these strengths to operate at full potential. Iraq's military, by contrast, suffered from rigid hierarchy, fear-based leadership, and limited initiative. When communication failed, adaptation failed with it. The Gulf War also revealed how technology could shape decision-making at the highest political levels. Leaders in Washington and allied capitals watched the conflict unfold through video feeds and digital briefings that created a sense of immediacy and control. Targets were debated, approved, and struck with unprecedented speed. This compressed decision cycles and created an expectation that future wars could be managed with similar precision from afar. War appeared more predictable, more manageable, almost engineered. This perception had profound consequences. If war could be fought quickly, decisively, and with relatively low casualties on one side, the threshold for using force appeared lower. The Gulf War did not make leaders eager for conflict, but it made them more confident that conflict could be contained. That confidence would be tested repeatedly in the decades that followed. The media dimension of the war reinforced this belief. The images broadcast around the world emphasized clean strikes and minimal coalition losses. The suffering on the ground in Iraq received far less attention. Destroyed infrastructure, civilian hardship, and long-term consequences were largely invisible during the conflict itself. Technology filtered reality, presenting a version of war that felt distant and abstract to audiences far from the battlefield. For Iraq, defeat did not end with the ceasefire. The destruction of infrastructure, combined with sanctions imposed afterward, pushed the country into prolonged crisis. Power grids damaged during the air campaign took years to recover. Economic collapse followed. While the coalition achieved its immediate objective of liberating Kuwait, Iraq emerged weakened, isolated, and unstable. The war solved one problem while planting the seeds for others. Militarily, the conflict triggered a wave of reassessment across the globe. States watched closely, studying what had happened in the desert. For technologically advanced militaries, the lesson seemed clear: invest in precision, networks, and integration. For others, the lesson was more unsettling. Conventional forces built around mass and attrition appeared obsolete against opponents with superior sensors and strike capabilities. This realization forced smaller states and non-state actors to think differently. Some sought to acquire similar technologies, accelerating arms development and proliferation. Others turned toward asymmetric strategies, focusing on guerrilla warfare, deception, and environments where technological advantages were harder to apply. The Gulf War did not eliminate conflict, it reshaped how adversaries planned to fight. Within the United States military, the war validated years of doctrinal experimentation. Concepts that had emerged after Vietnam, emphasizing joint operations, flexibility, and technological integration, appeared vindicated. The performance of air power, in particular, fueled debates about the future role of ground forces. Some argued that wars could be won primarily from the air. Others cautioned that Iraq was a unique case, warning against overgeneralization. Those warnings would prove prescient. The Gulf War's success was tied to specific conditions: a clear objective, overwhelming coalition support, open terrain, and conventional opponent using outdated doctrine. Technology magnified advantages, but it did not guarantee success in all contexts. Still, the belief that technology had fundamentally changed warfare took hold, shaping budgets, strategies, and expectations. At the same time, the war altered the relationship between soldiers and machines. Precision weapons reduced the need for massed forces, but increased dependence on complex systems. GPS failures, software glitches, and electronic interference suddenly became potential vulnerabilities. War was no longer just about bravery and numbers, it was about data integrity, system resilience, and technical superiority. A new set of risks emerged alongside new capabilities. For coalition soldiers, the experience reinforced a sense of professionalism and confidence. Many believed they had witnessed the future of war firsthand. For Iraqi soldiers, the lesson was harsher. Many felt abandoned by leadership that had promised resistance but delivered confusion. The disparity in experience highlighted a widening gap between those who fought with technology and those who faced it. Politically, the Gulf War seemed to affirm a new global order. The United Nations had acted decisively. A broad coalition had enforced international law. The Cold War's end appeared to offer a framework where aggression could be punished collectively. This optimism would not last, but in 1991 it felt real. Technology, combined with political unity, appeared to offer stability. Yet beneath that optimism, unresolved questions lingered. The war had demonstrated what advanced militaries could do to weaker ones, but it had not addressed how to build lasting peace afterward. It had showcased precision, but also revealed how destruction of systems could cripple civilian life long after fighting stopped. It had reduced coalition casualties, but not human suffering overall. Most importantly, it raised a fundamental question about the nature of warfare itself. If technology could tilt the balance so dramatically, would future wars be decided before soldiers even met on the battlefield? Or would adversaries adapt in ways that neutralize these advantages, dragging conflicts into new and unexpected forms? As militaries around the world raced to absorb the lessons of the Gulf War, one thing became clear. The conflict was not an endpoint, it was a beginning, a moment when warfare crossed a threshold, entering an era where information, precision, and perception became as decisive as armor and manpower. And as history would soon show, that transformation would bring not only new possibilities, but new dangers that few fully understood at the time. Those dangers began to reveal themselves almost immediately in the years that followed. The Gulf War had given the impression that war could be fast, decisive, and technologically controlled. But that impression rested on a narrow set of conditions. When those conditions disappeared, the limits of technological dominance became more apparent. The very tools that had delivered victory also created new dependencies, and with dependency came vulnerability. One of the most significant shifts was the way adversaries began to think about countering advanced militaries. Rather than attempting to match tanks with tanks or jets with jets, they focused on avoiding detection, dispersing forces, and blending into civilian environments. The lesson was simple: if you cannot defeat the system, refuse to present it with targets. Urban terrain, irregular formations, and decentralized command structures became more attractive precisely because they reduced the effectiveness of precision strikes. This adaptation challenged assumptions formed during the Gulf War. Technology excelled at identifying fixed installations, massed units, and clear command nodes. It struggled when faced with fighters who carried no radios, moved in small groups, and relied on local knowledge rather than centralized planning. The very precision that had defined the war in 1991 was less decisive in conflicts where the battlefield had no clear shape. At the same time, the Gulf War transformed how militaries understood air power. The conflict suggested that air campaigns could shape outcomes before ground forces engaged. This belief influenced planning in later interventions, sometimes with mixed results. Air power proved invaluable for rapid strikes and disruption, but it could not replace political solutions or control territory on its own. The war had shown what air power could do, but it also risked overstating what it could achieve. Another critical change lay in the relationship between technology and intelligence. Precision weapons depended on accurate information. Satellites, surveillance aircraft, and electronic monitoring became essential. But information was not static. Adversaries learned to manipulate it, hide within it, or overload it. Deception returned as a central element of warfare, not through elaborate ruses alone, but through the sheer volume of data that modern systems produced. Sorting signal from noise became as important as collecting information in the first place. The Gulf War also reshaped military culture. Training emphasized integration across services, speed of decision-making, and reliance on digital systems. This produced highly capable forces, but also raised concerns about overconfidence. Simulations and exercises could not fully replicate the chaos of real conflict. The danger lay not in technology itself, but in the belief that technology could remove uncertainty from war. History had not changed that much. Globally, the conflict accelerated an arms race of a different kind. Instead of focusing solely on nuclear deterrence or massive conventional forces, states invested in sensors, missiles, and cyber capabilities. Precision became the currency of power. Smaller states sought niche advantages, acquiring specific technologies that could threaten more powerful adversaries asymmetrically. The diffusion of these tools meant that the gap demonstrated in 1991 would not remain static. For civilians, the technological transformation of warfare brought ambiguous outcomes. Precision strikes reduced some forms of collateral damage, but attacks on infrastructure carried long-term humanitarian consequences. Power plants, water systems, and transportation networks, once targeted, affected daily life far beyond the battlefield. The line between military and civilian targets blurred as societies became more interconnected. War no longer ended when the shooting stopped. Its effects lingered in broken systems. Politically, the Gulf War altered expectations of intervention. Success created pressure to repeat it. When crises emerged in the 1990s and beyond, leaders and publics alike referenced the Gulf War as a model. The hope was that force, applied precisely and decisively, could resolve complex problems. In practice, those problems often proved resistant to military solutions, regardless of technological sophistication. The conflict also reshaped the role of alliances. The Gulf War demonstrated the effectiveness of multinational operations coordinated through shared technology and command structures. Interoperability became a priority, but coalition warfare introduced its own challenges. Political constraints, differing objectives, and varying levels of capability required careful management. Technology could connect forces, but it could not eliminate political friction. Within Iraq, the war's technological shock had lasting effects on military thinking. The defeat reinforced the belief among some that conventional confrontation with advanced powers was futile. This belief would influence later strategies, encouraging irregular warfare and exploitation of political vulnerabilities rather than direct military challenge. The Gulf War, in this sense, shaped not only how powerful states fought, but how weaker ones resisted. The war also changed public perceptions of what war looked like. The dominance of televised images created a sense of distance. Viewers saw explosions, not aftermath. Precision created the illusion of control. This altered how societies processed violence, making war seem cleaner and more contained than it truly was. Over time, this disconnect between perception and reality would complicate democratic oversight of military action. Technologically, the conflict marked the beginning of networked warfare. Systems did not operate in isolation. Sensors fed shooters, commanders monitored flows of information, and decisions moved through digital networks at unprecedented speed. This integration created powerful synergies, but also fragile dependencies. Disrupting one part of the network could degrade the whole. Future adversaries took note. As the decade progressed, it became clear that the Gulf War had not ended history. It had opened a new chapter defined by rapid adaptation. Militaries studied the war not as a final answer, but as a starting point. Exercises, doctrines, and procurement reflected its lessons, sometimes wisely, sometimes blindly. The danger lay in mistaking a moment of overwhelming advantage for a permanent condition. What the Gulf War truly demonstrated was not that technology could eliminate the fog of war, but that it could reshape it. Uncertainty did not disappear, it shifted. Instead of wondering where the enemy was, commanders worried about whether their information was accurate, their systems secure, and their assumptions valid. The battlefield became faster, more connected, and more complex. As new conflicts emerged, the promise of technological dominance would be tested again and again. Sometimes it would deliver stunning results. Other times it would falter against human factors no algorithm could predict. The Gulf War had changed modern warfare, but it had not simplified it. It had raised the stakes, accelerated the pace, and expanded the consequences. And as the world moved deeper into this new era, the question left by the Desert War remained unresolved. Had technology made war more controllable, or had it merely changed the ways in which control could fail? What followed as the ground war loomed was a strange psychological pause, a moment when Iraq still appeared defiant yet strategically hollow. Saddam Hussein's army, despite months of bombardment, remained numerically massive on paper. Nearly 1 million soldiers were dug in across Kuwait and southern Iraq, surrounded by trenches, berms, minefields, and artillery emplantments. From a distance, it looked formidable. From inside, morale was collapsing. Many units had been cut off from reliable supply lines. Food was scarce. Fuel was rationed. Electronic equipment had been destroyed or rendered useless by electronic jamming. Soldiers listened helplessly as coalition aircraft roared overhead day and night, knowing they could not fight back. Desertions quietly increased. Some troops buried their weapons or disabled vehicles simply to avoid being sent forward. Coalition planners understood this psychological erosion was as important as physical destruction. Leaflets were dropped by the millions, explaining how Iraqi soldiers could surrender safely, how to approach coalition forces, how to avoid being mistaken for combatants. Radio broadcasts repeated the same message. The goal was not just to defeat Iraq's army, but to convince it that fighting was pointless. This approach marked another evolution in warfare. Psychological operations were no longer side tools. They were integrated into the main campaign, synchronized with bombing schedules and ground movements. As February 1991 approached, General Norman Schwarzkopf finalized a plan that reflected both confidence and caution. Publicly, much of the world expected a direct frontal assault into Kuwait, a bloody clash against entrenched Iraqi defenses. Saddam expected the same. His best troops, including elements of the Republican Guard, were positioned to repel a coastal or southern attack. But beneath the surface, coalition commanders had designed something different, a massive left hook through the western desert, far from Kuwait's urban centers, would swing around Iraqi lines and strike from behind. It was a maneuver made possible by technology. Satellite navigation allowed armored units to cross featureless desert with precision. Secure digital communications kept divisions coordinated across hundreds of kilometers. Logistics systems tracked fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in near real time. In earlier wars, such a maneuver would have been reckless. Now it was calculated. When the ground war finally began on February 24th, it unfolded with stunning speed. Coalition forces surged forward almost immediately. In the east, U.S. Marines and Arab coalition units pushed into Kuwait, engaging Iraqi forces who were already disoriented and exhausted. In the west, U.S. Army Corps swept north and then east, executing the wide flanking maneuver that Iraqi commanders never fully grasped until it was too late. Armored columns advanced faster than many maps had predicted. Tanks equipped with thermal sights could see Iraqi positions through darkness, dust, and smoke, while Iraqi crews often saw nothing at all. Technology again shaped the battlefield in subtle but decisive ways. Thermal imaging turned night into an advantage rather than a limitation. GPS systems reduced navigational errors that historically plagued desert campaigns. Precision artillery and air support responded quickly to frontline requests, guided by digital targeting data rather than visual spotting alone. Iraqi units, accustomed to centralized command structures, found themselves unable to react. Orders from higher headquarters often never arrived. When they did, the situation on the ground had already changed. One of the clearest demonstrations of this imbalance came during clashes with the Republican Guard. These units were meant to be Saddam's elite force, better trained and better equipped than regular army formations, yet even they struggled. Coalition air attacks had degraded their armor and logistics before ground contact. When engagements occurred, coalition forces often detected Iraqi tanks first and destroyed them at long range. The idea of massed armored battles, once the centerpiece of Cold War military theory, seemed almost obsolete when one side possessed overwhelming situational awareness and precision firepower. Meanwhile, the retreat from Kuwait turned into one of the most infamous episodes of the war. As Iraqi forces fled north along the highway between Kuwait City and Basra, coalition aircraft attacked the convoy relentlessly. Destroyed vehicles littered the road for miles. Images of the so-called Highway of Death spread quickly, raising uncomfortable questions. Militarily, the strikes were justified as attacks on retreating enemy forces still capable of fighting. Politically and morally, they highlighted the asymmetry of the conflict. The war no longer looked like a contest between equals, it looked like annihilation. This imbalance began to influence decision-making at the highest levels. Coalition leaders worried not about losing the war, but about winning it too decisively. The original mandate was clear: expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait. It was not to overthrow Saddam Hussein or occupy Iraq. As Iraqi resistance collapsed faster than expected, questions emerged. How far should the coalition go? Should they continue north toward Baghdad? Would destroying the Republican Guard completely destabilize the region? Would a power vacuum invite chaos or Iranian influence? Technology again shaped these choices, not by forcing action, but by enabling restraint. With real-time intelligence, coalition commanders could see the scale of Iraqi collapse unfolding almost hour by hour. There was no need to gamble. The objective had effectively been achieved within days. On February 28th, after just 100 hours of ground combat, a ceasefire was declared. The speed stunned observers around the world. Wars were supposed to grind on. This one ended almost as soon as it began on the ground. Yet beneath the appearance of a clean victory, unresolved tensions remained. Saddam Hussein was still in power. His regime, though battered, survived. Iraq's infrastructure lay in ruins, its economy crippled by sanctions that would follow. In the immediate aftermath, uprisings erupted among Shiite and Kurdish populations, encouraged by ambiguous signals from outside powers. When those uprisings were brutally suppressed by Saddam's forces, many Iraqis felt abandoned. The war had changed the balance of military power, but it had not resolved the political future of Iraq. Globally, the Gulf War sent shockwaves through military establishments everywhere. Analysts pored over footage of precision strikes and night vision combat. Defense planners in Moscow, Beijing, and beyond took notes. The message was clear. Future wars would be fast, information-driven, and technologically asymmetric. Armies that relied on mass alone without integration of sensors, communications, and precision weapons would be vulnerable. The Soviet Union, already struggling economically and politically, watched this unfold with particular unease. Its own military doctrine suddenly looked outdated, expensive, and unsustainable. At the same time, the war reshaped public expectations. Western audiences saw a version of warfare that appeared almost bloodless on one side, smart bombs hitting targets cleanly, briefings with digital maps and video footage, casualties measured in dozens rather than tens of thousands. This perception, shaped heavily by technology and media control, created a dangerous illusion. It suggested that war could be precise, quick, and morally uncomplicated. Future conflicts would challenge that belief harshly. As the dust settled, the Gulf War stood as a turning point rather than an end point. It demonstrated what modern militaries could do, but also what they could not guarantee. Technology had delivered victory, but it had not delivered stability. Saddam Hussein's survival ensured that Iraq would remain a focal point of international tension for years to come. Sanctions, inspections, no-fly zones, and intermittent strikes would replace open war, creating a long, uneasy aftermath. The world had witnessed a new style of warfare, one defined less by trenches and attrition and more by sensors, satellites, and speed. Yet beneath that transformation, the same old questions remained unanswered. How does military victory translate into political peace? When overwhelming power is available, how should it be used, and when should it stop? And as technology continues to advance, will it make wars shorter and cleaner, or simply make their consequences harder to escape? The long-term consequences of the Gulf War were profound, reaching far beyond the deserts of Kuwait and Iraq. Militarily, it had set a new standard for what high-tech, information-driven warfare could achieve. Nations with access to advanced systems realized they could project power over great distances with unprecedented precision. The emphasis on integrated command, control, communications, and intelligence became central to military planning. For countries lacking such capabilities, the war was a cautionary tale. The lesson was clear. Without technological parity, even the most determined conventional forces risked collapse against a networked, precision-oriented adversary. This dynamic would shape defense spending, alliances, and military doctrine worldwide for decades. Politically, the Gulf War redefined intervention. The United Nations had provided legitimacy for action, and coalition cohesion had demonstrated the potential of multinational operations. But the aftermath also revealed limitations. Removing Iraqi forces from Kuwait achieved a clear goal, yet it did not solve the region's deeper conflicts. Saddam remained in power, and the harsh sanctions imposed afterward created long-term suffering without dislodging his regime. The war had been swift and decisive in military terms, but politically it left a legacy of unresolved tensions that would resurface repeatedly, culminating in the 2003 invasion of Iraq and decades of instability. In Iraq, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Civilian infrastructure had been heavily damaged, and years of sanctions crippled the economy. Hospitals, water systems, and electricity networks struggled to function. Ordinary Iraqis bore the human cost of a war won almost entirely by technology and strategy they could neither counter nor control. Uprisings among Shiite and Kurdish populations were brutally suppressed, demonstrating that military victory did not equate to political legitimacy or popular support. The war's aftermath would shape Iraq's internal dynamics and regional politics for generations. For the United States and its allies, the Gulf War reinforced confidence in technological superiority. Precision-guided munitions, night vision, satellite reconnaissance, and integrated logistics were now seen as essential components of military power. Future conflicts would be designed with these lessons in mind. Yet there was also a subtle danger. The perception of clean, low-risk war created expectations that would prove difficult to meet in more complex environments. Bosnia, Somalia, and later Iraq and Afghanistan would expose the limits of technology when facing irregular forces and political complexity. The Gulf War also accelerated the concept of network-centric warfare. Digital communication, real-time intelligence, and integrated command structures demonstrated how information could act as a force multiplier. However, this dependency created new vulnerabilities. Electronic warfare, cyber disruption, and the potential for technical failure became critical concerns. The battlefield had evolved from a contest of sheer firepower to a contest of information dominance, adaptability, and resilience. Culturally, the Gulf War influenced public understanding of conflict. Media coverage emphasized precision, speed, and technological mastery, creating an impression of clean warfare. Yet for Iraqis on the ground, war remained brutal and chaotic. This gap between perception and reality highlighted the power of narrative in shaping popular understanding of conflict. Technology had not only changed how wars were fought, but also how they were seen, remembered, and interpreted. The war also highlighted the ethical and strategic dilemmas posed by advanced weaponry. The highway of death attacks on retreating Iraqi forces sparked debate over proportionality and moral responsibility. While militarily justified within coalition planning, the imagery of thousands of destroyed vehicles and bodies raised uncomfortable questions about the human cost of technological efficiency. Precision had its limits, and ethical judgment remained essential in ways that machines could not replace. Regionally, the Gulf War reshaped the Middle East's balance of power. Kuwait was liberated, Saudi Arabia secured, and Iraq weakened, but instability remained. Iraq's regime, though militarily diminished, retained the capacity to threaten its neighbors. The war's aftermath sowed the seeds for future conflicts, including internal uprisings, regional tensions, and eventual foreign interventions. Technology had ensured short-term victory, but could not resolve long-term political complexity. On a global scale, the Gulf War served as a demonstration of post-Cold War military potential. The Soviet Union, teetering on the edge of collapse, observed a model of technologically integrated, coalition-driven warfare that contrasted sharply with its own doctrinal and logistical limitations. Other nations took note as well, understanding that the 1990s mark a transition from conventional attrition warfare to information-enabled, precision-driven conflicts. Perhaps most importantly, the Gulf War challenged assumptions about deterrence and vulnerability. Saddam Hussein had overestimated Iraq's ability to resist technologically superior forces and underestimated international resolve. States around the world took note. Technological inferiority could be as decisive as political weakness, and strategic miscalculations in the modern era could lead to rapid and comprehensive defeat. In retrospect, the Gulf War was more than a conflict over territory or oil. It was a watershed moment that transformed modern warfare. It demonstrated the power of technology, the value of coalition operations, and the importance of information dominance. It revealed the fragility of conventional assumptions and highlighted the complex interplay between military action, political objectives, and public perception. It changed expectations, doctrines, and the very definition of victory. As we examine subsequent conflicts in the Middle East and beyond, the echoes of the Gulf War remain clear. Precision weapons, real-time intelligence, networked command, and coalition operations continue to shape military strategy. Yet the war also serves as a reminder that technology alone cannot solve political problems, secure peace, or eliminate human suffering. Wars may be fought faster and more efficiently, but their consequences, strategic, ethical, and humanitarian, remain complex and enduring. In the end, the Gulf War asked a question that continues to resonate today. Has technology truly changed the nature of war forever, or did it just create the illusion of control that later conflicts would shatter?